Welcome to this final session of our Journey Through the Four Trials course. Right at the beginning of the semester, I asked you to consider your own thinking as we go through the course about the materials, the texts, the people, and the historical situations that we have studied, to ask you to consider how do these things hang together and what the main themes or questions of this course are. I left it as kind of an open question, what the course is about. So here in this final session, I would like to reflect for just a couple of minutes on the path that we have taken through quite a few human experiences, both at the individual level and at the level of large historical happenings. On this final session of the course, then, I would like to explore some of those questions myself, though I would be absolutely delighted to hear from you what your own thoughts are about what these themes are, and I know that I've also asked you to do this in another context. And it turns out, in my reflections about the course, that just about everything that we talk about in philosophy, at least in the areas of social and political philosophy, ethics, the philosophy of religion, existentialism, and the historical understanding of human experience, all of those questions are in one way or another invoked by the readings and the discussions that we've had in this course. So I've got a series of topics. First, social and political institutions. Our attention has been drawn to the reality of the fact that individuals always live within a social, political, and cultural setting. And it is just kind of built into that description that social arrangements are not chosen and crafted by the individual. The individual is influenced and is shaped and is disciplined into a particular set of ways of behaving within a social, political, and cultural system. Sometimes those arrangements are favorable and acceptable, and sometimes they are unfavorable, and sometimes they are flatly unacceptable. Always, from the pre-Socratic times of ancient Greece through Socrates, up through the Holocaust and the terrible events of the 20th century, the question of the coercive power of the state and the coercive power of society over the individual, this topic of coercion of the individual arises throughout the course. But also the question of the fairness and justice of social arrangements arises. And then the philosophical question, how should we judge the justice of the social arrangements that people find themselves living within? A second major theme is the question of personal responsibility and choice. A human being is not an insect, not an ant, programmed by a genetic program. The individual lives within a social order, but the individual is not a robot of the social order. Rather, individuals have moral principles, moral values, and the idea that one has a responsibility of living the compass of one's moral principles. If I believe that I should not impose gratuitous harm on other people, then I have a responsibility to live that principle in my everyday life, in small decisions, but also in large decisions. And yet we also know that in ordinary social life, there are different attitudes one can take towards the coercive and regulatory arrangements of the society and the politics which surround us. There are strategies of compliance, just doing what the state expects. There are strategies of accommodation, doing what one must do when in public and maybe disrespecting, discrediting those institutions when in private. And then there's the strategy of resistance. And we saw in several, in fact, most of the character biographies that we've considered, Nelson Mandela, Susan B. Anthony, Socrates, Galileo, Eichmann, and Bonhoeffer, we've seen different strategies chosen by these individuals. Mandela, Anthony, Socrates, Galileo, and Bonhoeffer chose the strategy of resistance to the social arrangements and political arrangements in which they found themselves. Eichmann chose the strategy of compliance. And we might say that Galileo is kind of a special case because he was both a resistor to the authority of the church, but also, when necessary, an accommodator. It is a basic reality of human life that individuals want to live. We don't give up our lives easily. We want our freedom. That is, we want not to be imprisoned or to be constrained to a particular way of living. We want not to be harmed or subjected to violence. We want to be able to walk down the street and not be beaten or lynched because of our manners or the way that we have interacted with other people. But states and social groups can impose all of these threats on people, which means that people are always subject to risk and always subject to the possibility of the loss of freedom or being subjected to violence or even subjected to the threat of death. And therefore, people always have to make a choice, whether to comply or to hide or to resist. We began the course, or at least very early in the course, we discussed the life of Marc Bloch, the very peaceable French professor of history who resisted and who joined the French resistance and was ultimately tortured and killed for his resistance. We talked quite a bit about issues of race, gender, and social domination. And we did that for a very specific reason. This is a very particular form and a very deep form of injustice that arises time and time again in the history of humanity about group discrimination, discrimination based on group characteristics, whether racism or patriarchalism or anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim prejudice. The different forms of prejudice and discrimination have found expression both in social practices and in political and legal systems. Societies and states have often historically committed crimes against groups defined by race and gender and religion. So women, Jews, Muslims, immigrants, people of African descent, all of these groups have been oppressed by systems of law or practice which deny their rights of equality and their worth as human individuals. Institutions have incorporated these forms of discrimination into everyday practices, and members of oppressed groups have sometimes, maybe even often, found their way to organized resistance. And we've seen several examples of powerful movements which arose as organized forms of resistance. The struggle for female suffrage in this country and other democratic countries, the struggle for the end of apartheid in South Africa and other African countries, the struggle for the end of Nazi oppression and extermination, and the struggle for the end of Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow social practices in the United States, the civil rights movement, in other words. All of these struggles involve efforts by individuals who came together to struggle for freedom. Social justice. This topic again comes up in almost all of the cases that we've considered. The question of the basic justice and fairness of the institutions within which we live. That topic of justice and fairness comes up again and again. When we considered the trial of Socrates, we considered whether the government processes, the processes of governance of the polis, whether these were fair and just processes. And we reflected on the idea, what did Athenians mean by justice? What is required for us to evaluate the justice of the polis? Moving forward 2,000 years, why was exclusive male suffrage in the United States and other democratic countries, why was male suffrage unjust? For that matter, why was apartheid unjust? Why was Jim Crow racial segregation unjust? Putting the coin on the other side, what is the basis for our thinking that all human beings are equal, that we are all equally worthy, and that we have an equal right to full participation in social and economic arrangements? Not all ideologies, not all religions, not all political philosophies have agreed with that assumption of human equality. So what is the basis for our belief today in the United States that all human beings are equal? Putting the point the other way around, what is wrong with racist ideology, Nazi ideology, the rhetoric of anti-immigrant hatred, and the rhetoric and practice of sexism and patriarchy? So social justice, political justice has been a recurring theme. Another recurring theme is the topic of human rationality and its cousin, the development and the creation of science. We discussed primarily the world of the Enlightenment, but at least in passing, we talked also about the emergence of scientific ideas and ideas of astronomy in the Muslim world, the Islamic world of the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages into the later Middle Ages. In our course, only Galileo raises the question of science directly, but almost all the figures we have studied have been committed to rationality and reason. There are just one or two important exceptions. Susan B. Anthony, Nelson Mandela, Socrates, Mark Bloch, all of these figures are strongly, explicitly, passionately committed to the idea that we should base our judgments about the world and our judgments about the justice of the world on reason and evidence. This is, at its heart, the rational, scientific attitude towards the world. In contemporary terms, all of these individuals, Anthony, Mandela, Socrates, Mark Bloch, others, all of them would have listened to Dr. Fauci today and the public health evidence about the impact of mask wearing and social distancing, and all of them would have complied. They accept the power and the importance of rationality and evidence, and they also believe in the importance of complying in adjusting one's behavior to the dictates of rational evidence with regard to what is harmful to other people. Speaking of harm, the topic of evil comes up repeatedly in the course, and we've talked, and very deliberately we've talked about the Holocaust, the final solution, the extermination of the European Jewry, the 20th century evils, which are so dramatic in our human history of the past 100, 150 years. We talked about the Holodomor, the war of hunger and starvation against Ukrainian peasants, the starvation of millions of men, women, and children by Stalin's state and his effort to subdue any sense of resistance or political independence by Ukraine. But we also talked about the evil of slavery in the United States, in the Caribbean, and South America, and the fact of enslaving of a whole people is a huge evil, which we have understood that we need to confront the evil of slavery and the history of slavery in the United States. Its close relation, Jim Crow racial oppression. We did do some learning about Jim Crow racial oppression and came to see that that system was a system of evil. It was a system of racial oppression embedded in the idea of the non-equal worth of all human beings. We spoke very briefly about the Gulag, which is Stalin's slave labor camps from the 40s, 50s, didn't come to an end really until the 1980s. We mentioned the Rwandan genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Bosnia under Serb nationalism. All of these events of the 20th and early 21st century are events of enormous, maybe unfathomable human harm committed by states and social groups without compassion or pity for reasons of hatred or expediency. And I think one thing that comes out of the way that we've shaped this course is that the problem of evil in society and in individual behavior is not a side issue, it's a core issue in coming to grips with our human history. Evil also exists in human beings, and so we were confronted with the question, was Eichmann evil? What is an evil action? Is banal evil, in the term that Hannah Arendt introduced, is banal evil less horrible, less awful than grand evil? Is Eichmann less evil than Hitler? Were the ordinary men in the Special Order Police unit described by Christopher Browning, were they evil? Or were they ordinary people doing evil things? Were the men who wrote the laws embodying the system of apartheid in South Africa after World War II, were they evil? Was Galileo, were the enemies of Galileo, the accusers of Galileo, they often appeared to act unethically, were they also evil? Thinking as a philosopher, we can ask the question, is evil just anything we morally disapprove of, or is it a special category, which I'm inclined to think. Evil is a special category. And Professor Stoichkowski's lecture kind of gave us a philosophical reason for thinking evil is something more than simply bad action. It kind of falls outside of the theory of ethics and is a more profound normative character. And so we might be able to pose the question, is evil as simple as a choice done for one's own interest in full knowledge that it is harmful to others and is morally unjustified? Well, we might say that that is morally wrong, but evil is something even more profound, perhaps even more non-rational, irrational. When we consider Socrates, or when we consider Galileo, the topic of integrity and acting according to one's inner compass comes naturally to mind. And we have some very clear examples of integrity, of men and women who chose difficult, dangerous, risky actions because their system of values, their personal system of values and principles dictated that they were obligated to do so. And so Socrates accepts the sentence of death. Mandela accepts prison, lifetime prison, though after 27 years he is released. Susan B. Anthony accepts the risks of trial and conviction. Galileo pursues his science in spite of the possibility of being burned at the stake. Marc Bloch acts out of his sense of patriotic duty to France, returning to France and joining the resistance. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer acts out of his own Christian convictions that he will not comply with Nazi atrocities. But other characters that we've seen have acted contrary to their convictions. They have acted without integrity, out of fear or expediency or profit. Galileo, I think, is an interesting case because he demonstrates integrity, but he does not demonstrate worthless heroism, or what he would regard as worthless heroism. He refused to allow the Catholic Church to have a reason to put him to death. And so he did renounce Copernican ideas, and yet he continued to do Copernican science. And the most basic, or at least my current take on the course, the most basic thing that we've confronted is the question of human history itself. We've got the theme of history and the theme of ourselves as historical beings. And so we've kind of posed the question, what is meant by knowing history? Why is it important for us as human beings to know about our human past? And I've kind of wanted to have us consider whether this is actually a hugely important kind of foundation of our identity as human beings, that we are rooted in a particular historical trajectory. Does knowing about the past create obligations for us in the present? Reparations for slavery, for example. And recall that we looked at Marc Bloch also as an historian and as a philosopher of history, on history as the study of men and women in action and in time, and his idea that the past is not different in kind from the present. We can understand the past by understanding the present. And then most fundamentally, we have had to address, I think we've wanted to address the question of whether there are moral imperatives or moral duties which arise from knowing the past. Do we have a duty to honestly confront the difficult truths of the past, or should we settle with the myths? We all belong to the resistance. We played a heroic role in resisting the Nazis. Or do we have to confront the more unpalatable truths of our past as human beings? And then secondly, do we have a duty to attempt to ensure that that these evils will not recur. I have thoroughly enjoyed going through this series of readings and questions with you, and I look forward to future engagements with you in the honors program.